Margot thought her life was finally coming together after marrying the man she loved. But what happens when family secrets and unspoken prejudices begin to tear everything apart? Stay tuned, because this story will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Margot walked into the bustling journalism department at the university, her dark curls bouncing as she carried a stack of books close to her chest. She was focused, determined, and ready to make her mark in a world that had not always been kind to people like her. It was her first semester, and though she knew the path ahead would be difficult, she believed in her abilities. Little did she know, this was the day that would change her life forever. Across the room, Brian sat slouched in a chair, flipping through a copy of the New York Times with a confident smirk. He was the kind of guy who drew attention effortlessly. Blonde, blue-eyed, with an air of easy charm. When Margot walked in, something about her presence caught his eye. She wasn't like the other girls he knew. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, as though she carried the weight of the world and yet refused to let it bend her. Intrigued, he stood and introduced himself, his curiosity piqued. Their connection was instant. They began spending late nights in the library, their conversations flowing easily from classic literature to the challenges of modern journalism. Margot shared her dreams of exposing injustices through her writing, inspired by the struggles she had faced as a black woman in America. Brian, in turn, spoke of his desire to travel the world, reporting stories that mattered. They challenged each other, inspired each other, and soon their professional camaraderie turned into something deeper. Despite their growing bond, Margot couldn't ignore the unease she felt about Brian's background. He came from a privileged white family in a small southern town, a world so different from hers. Though Brian assured her that his parents, Richard and Susan, would support their relationship, Margot couldn't shake the nagging doubts. The day Brian took Margot to meet his parents confirmed her fears. Richard and Susan greeted her with strained smiles, their eyes cold and judgmental. Susan, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and pearls, offered Margot a handshake that was more of a formality than a welcome. Richard barely looked at her, his disapproval evident in the tight set of his jaw. The dinner was a disaster. Every comment Richard made seemed designed to remind Margot that she didn't belong. He questioned her background, subtly undermining her accomplishments. Susan's remarks were no better, laced with condescension as she complimented Margot on her eloquence. Brian, oblivious or unwilling to confront the obvious tension, tried to keep the conversation light, but Margot left the evening feeling humiliated and deeply uncomfortable. Brian, however, remained steadfast in his devotion. When his parents privately confronted him, urging him to reconsider the relationship, he refused to listen. He accused them of being stuck in the past, of holding on to prejudices that had no place in the world he wanted to build. Richard and Susan were furious, but decided to let the matter rest, hoping he would come to his senses. Margot and Brian's love deepened in the months that followed. He proposed to her during a quiet evening in their favorite bookstore, surrounded by shelves of stories that had brought them together. Margot, with tears in her eyes, said yes, choosing to believe in the strength of their bond despite the obstacles ahead. Their wedding was both joyous and tense. Margot's family, vibrant and full of life, filled the ceremony with laughter and warmth. Brian's parents, however, sat stiffly in the front row, their disapproval barely concealed. Susan whispered to Richard throughout the vows, her expression sour as Margot and Brian exchanged promises of eternal love. Margot tried to focus on the positive, on the way Brian looked at her as though she was his entire world. But the shadows of his parents' judgment lingered in her mind. As they began their life together, Margot found herself caught between moments of bliss and a growing sense of isolation. Brian's love was genuine, but his inability to confront his parents' racism began to take its toll. Whenever they visited, Susan would make backhanded comments about Margot's cooking or her different way of doing things. Richard would dismiss her opinions during discussions, treating her as though she were invisible. Margot confided in Brian about how much it hurt, but he always tried to downplay the incidents. "They'll come around," he would say, brushing off her concerns. Margot wanted to believe him, but deep down she wondered if his optimism was naive. The tension came to a head during a family dinner when Richard made a blatantly racist remark, laughing as though it were a harmless joke. Margot froze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She looked to Brian, expecting him to defend her, but he simply shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her gaze. In that moment, Margot realized that love alone might not be enough to bridge the chasm between them. The chapter ends with Margot lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake, if she was fighting a battle she could never win, yet as tears streamed down her face, she resolved to hold on to hope, for Brian, for their love, and for the future she dreamed of building together. The wedding was behind them, and Margot and Brian were settling into their new life together in a modest apartment in downtown Atlanta. At first, it felt like they were living in a bubble, protected from the world's prejudices by the strength of their love. Margot threw herself into decorating their space, turning it into a warm, inviting home filled with books, framed photos, and the vibrant colors of her culture. Brian, meanwhile, was adjusting to his new job at a local newspaper, often coming home late but always greeting Margot with a kiss and stories about his day. Their moments of happiness were genuine, but Margot couldn't shake the growing discomfort she felt whenever they interacted with Brian's parents. Richard and Susan would call occasionally, their conversations thinly veiled critiques of their son's choices. Margot often overheard Susan's voice on the other end of the line, dripping with disdain, as she asked Brian if he was sure about all this, or if he regretted rushing into marriage. Brian would defend their relationship, but Margot could feel the strain it placed on him. He loved his parents, despite their flaws, and Margot knew it was difficult for him to balance his loyalty to them with his commitment to her. The first time Richard and Susan visited their apartment, Margot went out of her way to make them feel welcome. She cooked a meal inspired by her grandmother's recipes, hoping to share a piece of her heritage with them. But the evening quickly soured. Richard barely acknowledged the food, pushing it around his plate without taking more than a few bites. Susan commented on the spices, implying they were too strong for her taste. When Margot tried to share stories about her upbringing, Susan interrupted her with patronizing remarks, steering the conversation back to Brian's achievements. Margot felt invisible, as though she were merely an accessory to her husband's life. After they left, Margot confronted Brian about his parents' behavior. She told him how their words and actions made her feel unwelcome in her own home. Brian listened, but seemed reluctant to take a firm stance. "They're set in their ways," he said, trying to soothe her. "It doesn't mean they don't care about us." Margot wanted to believe him, but their visits left her feeling drained and disheartened. As time went on, Richard and Susan's disdain became more overt. They started dropping by unannounced, often catching Margot in moments when she was unprepared to entertain guests. Richard would make comments about the state of the apartment, implying that Margot wasn't a good homemaker. Susan, meanwhile, would accidentally forget Margot's name in conversations or refer to her as Brian's wife, rather than addressing her directly. It was clear to Margot that these were not innocent oversights, but calculated attempts to diminish her presence. The turning point came during a family gathering at Richard and Susan's house. Margot had been hesitant to attend, knowing how uncomfortable these events usually made her feel. But Brian convinced her that it was important to show his parents that they were a united front. The evening started awkwardly, with Richard making a sarcastic comment about Margot's choice of attire, implying it was a bit much for such a casual dinner. Margot bit her tongue, determined not to let them get under her skin. However, things escalated when Susan brought up the topic of children. "So, Margot," she began, her tone deceptively sweet, "have you two talked about starting a family? I can't help but wonder what the little ones will look like. Such an interesting mix, don't you think?" The room fell silent. Margot felt a wave of anger and humiliation wash over her, but before she could respond, Brian spoke up. "Mom, that's enough," he said, his voice firm but controlled. It was the first time he had directly called out his mother's behavior, and, for a moment, Margot felt a glimmer of hope. But the confrontation was short-lived. After dinner, Susan pulled Brian aside, whispering loud enough for Margot to hear, "You're letting her ruin this family." Margot's heart sank as she watched Brian struggle to respond. He looked torn, caught between defending his wife and maintaining peace with his parents. That night, as they drove home, Margot couldn't hold back her frustration. "Do you see what they're doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They don't respect me. They don't respect us." Brian sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I know, Margot, I know, but they're my parents. It's complicated." Margot felt a pang of sadness as she realized that, despite his love for her, Brian might never fully stand up to his parents. She began to wonder how much longer she could endure their constant belittlement and his unwillingness to confront it. Back at home, Margot lay awake, replaying the evening in her mind. She thought about the dreams they had shared when they first fell in love, the promises they had made to each other. She wanted to believe that their relationship could withstand the challenges they faced, but the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. As she stared at the ceiling, she felt a growing sense of isolation, as though she were fighting a battle she could never win. Margot's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. She was going to be a mother. A surge of emotions overwhelmed her. Joy, fear, hope. For a moment, the tension of the past months faded away, replaced by the thought of the new life growing inside her. She smiled, imagining Brian's reaction. Surely, this would bring them closer together, a chance to start fresh and rebuild their bond. Margot carefully wrapped the test in tissue paper and placed it in her pocket, eager to share the news with her husband when he returned from work. That evening, Brian came home looking exhausted, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. Margot greeted him with a warm smile, hiding her nervous excitement as she placed dinner on the table. "I have something to tell you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Brian looked up, curious but distracted. Margot reached into her pocket, pulling out the test and placing it in front of him. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. For a moment, Brian's tired expression melted into one of pure joy. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Margot nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Brian stood and pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "This is amazing, Margot. You're amazing." For the first time in months, Margot felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this baby would be the bridge that mended the cracks in their relationship. In the weeks that followed, Brian seemed to transform. He was attentive and affectionate, constantly asking Margot how she was feeling and discussing baby names with her. He even began to stand up to his parents, albeit subtly, whenever they made disparaging remarks about Margot. When Susan asked if they planned to raise the child properly, Brian quickly shut her down, saying, "Mom, Margot and I will decide what's best for our family." Margot felt a renewed sense of love for her husband, believing that they were finally on the right path. But Richard and Susan were far from giving up. The news of Margot's pregnancy only deepened their resentment. They saw the baby not as a blessing, but as another way Margot was tying Brian down. Susan began calling Brian more frequently, often when Margot wasn't around, filling his head with doubts and fears. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she would ask. "A child is a huge responsibility, and let's face it, Margot comes from a very different background. Do you really think she'll be a good mother?" Richard, meanwhile, planted seeds of distrust, suggesting that Margot was only interested in securing her place in the family by having a baby. Slowly, their manipulations began to take root. Brian, who had been so excited and supportive, started to withdraw. He became irritable and distant, snapping at Margot over minor things. When she asked him what was wrong, he would dismiss her concerns, saying he was just stressed about work. Margot tried to be patient, believing that the pressures of impending fatherhood were weighing on him. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that his parents were behind his sudden change in behavior. As Margot's pregnancy progressed, the situation worsened. Richard and Susan's visits became more frequent, and their remarks grew increasingly cruel. One evening, as Margot was preparing tea, she overheard Susan telling Brian, "You need to think about your future, Brian. This baby is going to complicate everything. Do you really want to be stuck in this situation for the rest of your life?" Margot froze, her hand trembling as she held the teapot. She couldn't believe the audacity of Susan's words. What hurt even more was Brian's silence. He didn't defend Margot or their unborn child. He simply muttered, "It's not that simple, Mom." That night, Margot confronted Brian. "Why do you let them talk about me like that?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "Why don't you stand up for me, for us?" Brian avoided her gaze, his shoulders slumping. "It's not that easy, Margot," he said weakly. "They're my parents. I can't just cut them off." Margot's heart broke as she realized that Brian's loyalty to his parents might always outweigh his commitment to her. The breaking point came during a dinner at Richard and Susan's house. Margot, now 7 months pregnant, was already feeling vulnerable and exhausted. As they sat around the table, Richard began making thinly veiled comments about how some people were not fit to raise children. Susan chimed in, suggesting that Margot should consider hiring help since she might struggle to balance motherhood with her limited experience. Brian, instead of defending Margot, laughed nervously, as if trying to diffuse the tension. Margot felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She excused herself and went to the bathroom, where she locked the door and cried silently. When they returned home, Margot couldn't hold back her feelings any longer. "I can't do this, Brian," she said, her voice breaking. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when your parents treat me like I'm nothing, and what's worse is that you let them. Do you even care about me? About our child?" Brian looked at her, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "You don't understand, Margot," he said. "They're my family. They just want what's best for me." Margot stared at him in disbelief. "What's best for you? And what about me? What about this baby? Am I just supposed to put up with their hate because they're your parents?" Brian had no answer. He simply turned away, leaving Margot to sit alone in the silence of their living room. That night, as she lay in bed, Margot placed her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the faint kicks of her baby. She whispered softly, "It's just you and me now, little one. I'll protect you. I promise." In that moment, Margot realized that she couldn't rely on Brian to stand by her. She would have to find the strength to stand on her own for the sake of her child. Margot's hands trembled as she clutched her coat tightly around her swollen belly. The winter air bit at her skin as she stood outside their apartment building, her tears freezing against her cheeks. Brian had just shouted at her again, his words cutting deeper than any wound. His parents' influence had finally taken hold, transforming the man she once loved into someone unrecognizable. For months now, she had endured his coldness, his accusations, and his refusal to shield her from the venom of his parents. But tonight, something had broken in him. His anger had reached a boiling point, and he demanded that she leave. The argument had started over something trivial, a misplaced set of keys, but it quickly escalated into a barrage of cruel words. Brian had accused her of being ungrateful, of always causing tension between him and his parents. "Maybe they were right about you," he had said, his voice venomous. Margot froze at his words, unable to comprehend the hatred in his tone. "Right about what, Brian?" she had whispered, tears filling her eyes. "About you being manipulative. About you trying to trap me with this baby?" he spat, his face twisted with rage. Margot had gasped, the pain of his words striking her like a physical blow. Before she could respond, he had pointed to the door and yelled, "Get out!" And now she stood there, the icy wind swirling around her as she tried to steady her breathing. She looked up at the darkened windows of their apartment, realizing that the home they had built together was no longer hers. Her heart ached as she thought of the man she had fallen in love with, the one who used to read her favorite poems aloud and dream of a bright future with her. That man was gone, replaced by someone who let hatred and prejudice dictate his actions. Margot began to walk, her steps crunching against the snow-covered pavement. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there any longer. Her mind raced as she replayed the events of the past months, the subtle jabs from Richard and Susan, the moments when Brian had looked the other way, the nights she had cried herself to sleep while he pretended not to notice. She thought of the child growing inside her and felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let her baby be born into this toxic environment. She had to protect them, no matter what it took. She eventually found herself at a small park, the benches dusted with snow and the bare trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. Margot sank onto one of the benches, cradling her belly as she let the tears flow freely. She thought of her mother, who had always been her rock, and realized she had no choice but to go back to her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the life she was carrying, the future she needed to build for her child. The walk to her mother's house felt endless, but Margot pushed through the cold and exhaustion. When she finally reached the small, familiar home, She hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Her mother, Lillian, opened it almost immediately, her face etched with concern as she took in Margot's tear-streaked face and the trembling in her hands. "Margot, what's happened?" Lillian asked, pulling her daughter inside and wrapping her in a warm embrace. Margot broke down, sobbing into her mother's shoulder as she tried to explain everything: the cruelty of Brian's parents, the way he had changed, and the moment he had thrown her out. Lillian listened patiently, her grip on Margot tightening with each word. When Margot finished, Lillian looked her in the eyes and said firmly, "You're safe now. You don't have to go back to him. We'll figure this out together." Margot nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. Over the next few days, Margot began to rebuild her life. She filed for divorce, a decision that was both painful and liberating. Brian tried to contact her once, leaving a voicemail that alternated between apologies and blaming her for the failure of their marriage. Margot deleted it without listening to the end. She knew now that she couldn't let him back into her life, not after everything he had said and done. Her priority was her child, and she was determined to create a stable, loving environment for them. As her due date approached, Margot focused on preparing for the arrival of her baby. Lillian was by her side every step of the way, helping her set up a nursery and offering words of encouragement when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. Margot found strength in the quiet moments, like feeling her baby kick or imagining the life they would share together. She promised herself that her child would never feel the pain of rejection or the sting of prejudice. She would raise them to be strong, to know their worth, and to stand tall in a world that so often sought to diminish them. The night her water broke, Margot felt a mix of fear and excitement. Lillian rushed her to the hospital, holding her hand as she breathed through the contractions. Hours later, Margot gave birth to a healthy baby boy. As she held him in her arms for the first time, tears streamed down her face. "Elijah," she whispered, the name feeling like a beacon of hope. "You're my everything." Margot's heart swelled with love as she looked at her son, his tiny fingers gripping hers. In that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. She had left behind a life of pain and found the strength to start anew. For the first time in a long time, Margot felt at peace. 3 years had passed since Margot left Brian and their toxic marriage behind. She had built a life for herself and her son, Elijah, filled with love, resilience, and hope. Margot had returned to her passion for journalism, working part-time for a local paper while balancing her responsibilities as a single mother. Elijah had grown into a bright and cheerful toddler, his laughter filling the small but cozy home they shared with Lillian. Every day, Margot felt more grateful for the decision she had made, knowing it had been the best choice for both of them. Margot had come to accept the rhythm of her new life, though it was not without its challenges. There were nights when exhaustion would take hold, and she would sit by Elijah's bed, watching him sleep and wondering if she was doing enough for him. But in those moments of doubt, she would remind herself of the strength she had found within. Her son was happy, healthy, and loved. That was what mattered most. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margot was preparing Elijah for their usual walk to the park. He bounced with excitement as she helped him into his little jacket and shoes. As they were about to step outside, there was a knock at the door. Margot's stomach twisted. Unexpected visitors were rare. She opened the door cautiously and froze when she saw Brian standing there. He looked nothing like the man she remembered. His once confident posture was slumped, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were red as though he hadn't slept in days, and his hands trembled as he clutched his hat nervously. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elijah, sensing the tension, clung to Margot's leg, his wide eyes darting between the stranger and his mother. "Margot," Brian finally said, his voice hoarse, "please, can I talk to you?" Margot's initial reaction was to shut the door in his face. She wanted to shield herself and Elijah from the pain that Brian represented, from the memories of his cruelty and the rejection she had endured. But something in his expression stopped her. Against her better judgment, she stepped outside, closing the door behind her to keep Elijah from hearing their conversation. "What are you doing here, Brian?" she asked, her tone cold and guarded. "You made it clear 3 years ago that we weren't worth fighting for." Brian flinched at her words, guilt etched across his face. "Margot, I know I have no right to ask for anything after the way I treated you," he began, his voice shaking. "I've spent the past 3 years trying to come to terms with what I did, with how I let my parents' hatred consume me. I've been in therapy, I've been trying to make amends with myself, but the truth is, I can't move forward without at least trying to make things right with you." Margot crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You think you can just show up after 3 years and apologize? That's supposed to erase everything you put me through? The humiliation, the betrayal, the pain of being thrown out while I was pregnant with your child?" Brian shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, I know it won't erase anything. I know I can never undo the damage I caused. But I had to see you, to see Elijah. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to be part of his life. I want to be a better father than I was a husband." Margot's heart clenched at his words. She thought of Elijah, who had never known his father, and the potential impact Brian's presence could have on him. But she also thought of the promises Brian had made before, promises he had broken over and over again. Could she trust him now, after everything? "I don't know if I can let you into his life, Brian," she said, her voice firm. "Elijah is my priority, and I won't let anyone hurt him the way you hurt me. You say you've changed, but how do I know this isn't just another excuse, another empty promise?" Brian took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I don't expect you to trust me, not right away. But I'm willing to prove myself. I'll do whatever it takes, Margot. Please, just give me a chance." Margot studied him, searching for any signs of insincerity. She saw only a broken man, desperate to make amends. But she also knew that desperation wasn't enough. Trust had to be earned, and she couldn't risk Elijah's happiness on the chance that Brian might fail again. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her tone measured. "But for now, you need to leave. Elijah and I have built a good life, and I won't let anything jeopardize that." Brian nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Margot. That's more than I deserve." As he turned and walked away, Margot felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and an ache she hadn't expected. She took a deep breath and went back inside, where Elijah was waiting with his bright, curious eyes. "Who was that, Mama?" he asked, tilting his head. "Just someone from the past, baby," Margot said, kneeling down to hug him. "Someone who doesn't matter as much as you do." As they headed to the park, Margot pushed Brian from her mind. Her focus was on Elijah, on the life they had created together and the future she was determined to protect. Whatever came next, Margot knew she had the strength to face it, just as she always had. The soft hum of Elijah's laughter echoed through the small park as Margot pushed him on the swing. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the playground, and for a moment, Margot allowed herself to bask in the simple joy of watching her son play. His face lit up with pure delight, his tiny hands gripping the chains as he called out, "Higher, Mama!" Margot smiled, her heart full, knowing that every sacrifice she had made was worth it to see him this happy. It had been a week since Brian had shown up on her doorstep, and though she had tried to push the encounter from her mind, his words lingered. He wanted to be part of Elijah's life, but Margot couldn't ignore the pain he had caused. She had spent years rebuilding herself, shielding Elijah from the chaos Brian had left behind. Letting him back in felt like opening a door to the past, a past she had worked tirelessly to leave behind. As she pushed Elijah higher, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Margot." She froze, her hands tightening on the swing. Turning slowly, she saw Brian standing a few feet away, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He looked hesitant, almost nervous, as though he knew he was intruding. Margot's heart sank. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, and certainly not here. "Brian," she said, her voice firm but calm, "what are you doing here?" "I'm sorry," he began, taking a cautious step forward. "I wasn't trying to ambush you, I've been thinking about what you said, and I wanted to give you something." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Margot eyed it warily, her instincts telling her to stay on guard. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her distance. "It's a letter," he said quietly. "I wrote it after our last conversation. I know I can't say everything I need to in person, so I put it all in here. I don't expect you to read it now, but please, just take it. If you never want to speak to me again after this, I'll respect that." Margot hesitated, glancing back at Elijah, who was oblivious to the tension, still giggling as he swung back and forth. With a reluctant sigh, she took the envelope, slipping it into her bag. "Fine," she said, her tone cool, "but I meant what I said, Brian. My son comes first." "I understand," Brian replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for even considering this." Before Margot could respond, Elijah called out, "Mama, look at me." He had climbed onto the jungle gym, his small frame perched precariously on one of the higher platforms. Margot's heart leapt as she rushed over to steady him, momentarily forgetting Brian's presence. When she turned back, he was gone, leaving her with the envelope and the questions it carried. That evening, after Elijah was asleep, Margot sat at the kitchen table, the envelope lying in front of her. She stared at it for what felt like hours, debating whether to open it. Part of her wanted to tear it to pieces, to reject any attempt Brian made to re-enter their lives. But another part of her, the part that had once loved him, urged her to read it, to see if he truly had changed. Finally, she picked it up and broke the seal. The handwriting was familiar, a reminder of the days when they used to leave each other little notes filled with love and promises. She took a deep breath and began to read. The letter was long, filled with apologies and reflections. Brian wrote about the guilt that had consumed him after their separation, the regret he felt for allowing his parents to poison their marriage. He admitted to being weak, to failing her and Elijah in ways he could never undo. He spoke about the therapy he had undergone, the hard truths he had faced about himself and his upbringing. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't feel he deserved it. All he wanted, he wrote, was the chance to show Elijah that he could be better, that he could be a father his son could one day be proud of. By the time Margot finished reading, tears blurred her vision. The letter stirred emotions she had buried long ago: anger, sadness, and, to her surprise, a faint glimmer of hope. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Could she trust Brian to keep his word? Could she risk letting him into Elijah's life, knowing the damage he was capable of? The next morning, as Margot prepared breakfast, Lillian noticed the weariness in her daughter's eyes. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Margot hesitated before pulling the letter from her bag and handing it to her mother. Lillian read it silently, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she set the letter down and looked at Margot. "He sounds sincere," she said cautiously, "but sincerity doesn't erase the past. The question is, do you believe he's truly changed? And even if he has, are you ready to let him back in?" "I don't know," Margot admitted, her voice trembling. "Part of me wants to give him a chance, for Elijah's sake. But the other part of me is terrified. What if he hurts us again?" Lillian reached across the table, taking Margot's hand in hers. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But remember, you're not the same woman you were 3 years ago. You're stronger now. Whatever happens, you'll handle it." Later that day, as Margot watched Elijah play with his blocks, she thought about the future. She thought about the life she had built for her son, the sacrifices she had made to protect him. Letting Brian back into their lives was a risk, one that could either bring healing or reopen old wounds. But as she looked into Elijah's bright, curious eyes, she knew one thing for certain: whatever decision she made, it would be for him. Elijah deserved the best, and Margot would do everything in her power to ensure he had it. For now, she placed the letter in a drawer, its contents lingering in her mind. The future was uncertain, but Margot knew she had the strength to face it, just as she always had. No matter what came next, she and Elijah would be okay. They had to be. Thank you for watching this emotional journey. What would you do in Margot's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another story. See you in the next one.